I don't think I have a changing moral standard. I think my moral framework starts from the assumption that what I care about is the well-being of conscious creatures. And from there, I can build out the rest of my moral framework. This doesn't change over time.
Your moral system starts with?
I'm concerned with the well-being of conscious creatures.
That's it.
Yeah, so let's get this out of the way first. A moral system whose sole precept is the well-being of conscious creatures will inevitably lead to contradictions and absurd situations. Like, for instance, what matters more, the well-being of the rapist or the well-being of the victim? You have a conflict there which you cannot solve by simply appealing to the notion of well-being, because that notion applies to all humans. So you cannot simply disregard the well-being of the rapist without a clear and objective reasoning, saying, it's wrong, it's bad, it's obviously moral, it's not obvious to anyone when your entire moral system doesn't actually support that. I've already addressed this problem here, but here's a brief summary. I believe morality rests on at least three precepts: the well-being of the individual, the well-being or stability of the society, and whatever we feel to be right. The last one is the most objective of them all, evidently, which is why the other two superseded in importance. We only invoke whatever we feel to be right or moral when we lack the evidence to prove it objectively. But at that point, that's the best we got anyway. But at a fundamental level, the well-being of the individual only matters so long as it doesn't lead to social destruction, because morality doesn't describe what individuals should and shouldn't do, but what individuals should and shouldn't do in a social context, because morality is a social system. It describes how individuals ought to behave in society. In this context, the victim's well-being supersedes the well-being of the rapist, because if we allow or not punish rape, then society destabilizes itself. Nobody wants to live in a society where rape is allowed. I would argue that not even rapists want that, because they too will have families, wives, daughters, that they wouldn't want to experience that. And even if they wouldn't care, it doesn't matter, because the fact is that the vast majority of people do care. We're biologically hardwired to protect ourselves and our loved ones against suffering and death, and rape fits that description perfectly. Which means that, essentially, morality is built by people who want to live peacefully and safely in a human society, want to protect themselves and those they love. My entire point here is that this dude's moral system is very flimsy, but this is what we got, this is what we're working with. Plus, it doesn't really matter, because the point of the discussion isn't how robust the secular moral framework is, but whether it's unchanging or not.
So I'll just ask you a simple question based on this ethical system of the care of conscious creatures. If you had two brothers and they wanted to engage in an incestuous sexual relationship, can you tell me what's the problem is with that?
I don't think there is a problem with that.
Okay. And can you tell me how that would be good for society?
I don't think it would be bad for society.
Yeah, tell me how it would be good.
I think it would be neutral.
It wouldn't be neutral, it would be bad. Incestuous relationships dilute the notion of consent because the parties involved are relatives. So there's a power dynamic there that doesn't exist in normal relationships, which opens the door to abuse, often veiled under issues like the Stockholm Syndrome. It's bad for the individual because it alters their perception of family relationships. Brothers, mothers, fathers, sisters can also be lovers, which will lower their ability to engage in healthy, normal relationships once they're out of that incestuous affair. These things make incest bad for society as well, because they break down the notion of family, and family is supposed to be built on trust, protection, and clear roles. And we need to protect the notion of family because we are social animals who require family, protection, and guidance to develop into healthy and stable members of society. It would have been interesting to hear Andrew's response to this question. Would that answer have been, because God says so, in which case his moral foundation would have been exposed as void? Or would he have voiced the reasoning I offered here, in which case the Christian framework would have become irrelevant, because this reasoning only considers the health and stability of the society as the only relevant reference point? But he didn't offer his perspective, so I guess we don't know. Maybe in a later video.
Okay, so let me ask you another one. Let's pretend for a second that there was a old lady who lived, right? And all she ever dreamed about was after she died that people would have sex with her dead body. And they happened to find a few necrophiliacs who just really were into that. She donated her body. She put it in her will, right? And so after she croaked, man, one after another, they checked them for disease. They all wore condoms. What's the problem with them banging her dead body, bro?
I think there's probably some like surrounding issues
Like?
of allowing people to have sex with a dead body. I think there would probably be some other like you would use as degenerate behavior.
What?
That would come along for the ride with people who would be into that
Like
kind of
what?
stuff. We should probably outlaw.
Like what?
Well, if they're into having sex with dead people, they might be encouraged to have sex with dead people that maybe
I don't
didn't
know. That sounds
consent
like
to that,
sounds
or
like
maybe
a
they wanna
slippery
kill
slope.
people,
That's like
Okay, that was a sloppy answer, but at least the dude did offer an answer, right? It would be wrong to allow for necrophilia because that practice usually suggests some type of mental disorder, and it could incentivize perpetrators to start killing people. I would also argue that it's wrong because it violates concepts like human dignity and personhood, and essentially turns humans into chunks of flesh only useful for satisfying one's pleasures. It's not difficult to see how dehumanizing people is bad practice. Remember when I said that sometimes the well-being of society matters more than the well-being of the individual? This is one of those cases. But what is Andrew's answer to that?
sounds like
maybe
a
they wanna
slippery
kill
slope.
people,
That's
or
like when they
maybe
say if you're
want
going to be sexual, you're probably going to be more likely to molest little boys. Sounds like a
I don't
slippery
think
slope.
that's true at all.
I mean,
but
it is true. Definitionally, it's true. Men can't molest little boys unless they're homosexuals. They're same-sex sex
Catholic Church has a
activity.
big
Alright, so I couldn't confirm what Andrews is saying here. All I could find on this topic was here, which doesn't support his claim, and which I don't trust because it has LGBT in its name, and here, which does support his claim, and which I also don't trust because, oh well. Now, I'm not a master researcher, okay? I could be wrong on this, but as it stands, it looks like most child abusers are straight males, including when the victims are also males. So yeah, it is possible for men to molest little boys despite not being homosexual themselves. It seems to me like Andrews' argument rests not so much on actual data as it does on the it's just common sense, bro. Which is stupid because common sense is learned behavior, which means it can be wrong. Plus, what Andrews is saying here is that the dude invoking the slippery slope argument for banning necrophilia is evidence of hypocrisy, because he isn't doing the same for the link between homosexuality and child abuse, which is fallacious reasoning. It's irrelevant whether he applies the same reasoning to homosexuality or not. Being a hypocrite doesn't make him wrong. So Andrews is focused on the wrong thing here because, and this is just my opinion, he doesn't actually have the tools to dismantle the argument. So instead, he chose to call the dude a hypocrite instead, which is irrelevant.
So same-sex sex
Catholic Church
activity.
has a big problem there.
Yeah, in public schools is a bigger problem. 100 times more likely, I can give you the study right now if you'd like it, to be molested in a school than in a church.
This may be a non-point here, but I found it interesting how Andrew immediately deflected the dude's mention of Catholic Church's abuses by mentioning school abuses. 100 times more likely, he says, as if the fact that children being 100 times more likely to be molested in a school than in the Catholic Church means that church-related abuses are fine or acceptable somehow.
And so here's the problem, right? Can that standard that you just gave me of two brothers having an incestuous relationship, could that change? Could your
what
opinion
change?
on that change?
Yeah, I could probably change.
And so the morality of that thing would change, right?
I mean,
So it's not an
could
unchanging
change
standard, is it?
No, it
Wrong. See, what Andrew is doing here is mistaking the concept of the morality of a specific situation for the moral system itself. Yes, our view of a specific moral act can change. That doesn't mean that the entire moral system or moral standard changes. The standard is still, at least in the dude's framework, the well-being of conscious creatures. That doesn't change. How he views specific actions under that standard can change as his understanding of the world changes. Whether intentional or not, Andrew seems to confuse these two things. But there's another point worth mentioning. It seems to me like Andrew's position is that even changing your moral stance on specific moral acts is bad, which is simply an untenable position because Christianity itself has changed its position on different moral situations. Here's an example showcasing precisely this from his discussion with his very next opponent.
We would be trying to go off of Christian standards themselves.
But those Christian standards clearly have changed. I mean,
Where?
depending, I mean, like I just said,
Are you allowed to steal in Christianity?
I don't believe so.
Okay. Are you allowed to murder?
No.
No. Okay. All right.
Well, you,
Well, yeah, murder is bad in the Bible because murder is implicitly defined as something bad.
Definitionally, it's true.
But that aside, what does murder mean, Andrew? It means unjustified and intentional killing, right? Now, all I have to do is redefine what unjustified means, and I can make some murders not be murders anymore, which is exactly how it was back in Christian days when executing witches, non-believers, or those accused of blasphemy was considered godly justice and moral, whereas today that's no longer the case, including within the Christian framework. And it's at this point that I kind of suspect that Andrews realized the problem. The Christian stance on specific moral issues has changed over the course of history, and I think he realized he cannot argue that point. He also realized that he was essentially arguing the wrong thing. He was arguing that the secular moral system changes its moral stance on specific issues, which nobody disagreed with, when his initial point was that the secular moral system changes the standard itself, in this case, valuing the well-being of conscious creatures. And this is where we get to the meat of it.
My standard
Let's
of
find
what I
out.
care about conscious
Okay.
creatures
Let's find
does
out.
not change.
So Andrew just made a statement that's not true, but he needs it to be true. He needs to have the dude admit that his moral standard, the preference for human well-being, can change. Otherwise, he would have no ground to stand on, and this entire debate would be essentially lost. Which brings us this invaluable gem.
My standard
Let's
of
find
what
out.
I care about conscious
Okay.
creatures
Let's find
does
out.
not change.
Let's find out if this is the case, even right. Your care about conscious creatures, and that's where you build your entire ethical
Yep.
system out of, right? So let us assume for a moment that somebody were to provide to you evidence that there was better outcomes for everybody, right? Just purely hypothetical. If you didn't care about the well-being of conscious creatures, just you personally. If somehow they provided you evidence that you
that goes to my
personally,
second axiom of imperfect knowledge. I don't think it's
Okay, so
possible.
Here, let me spell it out for you. Somebody were to provide you evidence that there was better outcomes for everybody if you didn't care about the well-being of conscious creatures. If the problem isn't immediately obvious, let me ask you this. What does better outcomes refers to? Better in what sense? As in, everybody would get to live better lives if you didn't care about the well-being of conscious creatures? But if I were to desire that everybody lived better lives, doesn't that imply that I care about their well-being? How can you hold a position that you no longer care about the well-being of conscious creatures because this would help those conscious creatures live better lives? By definition, this means that I actually care about the well-being of conscious creatures, right? Am I right or am I right? What does better mean, Andrew? Well, he doesn't know because he didn't prepare this argument. He just pulled it out of his ass on the spot without realizing it's a nonsense, and to his luck, the dude chose not to engage with a hypothetical, which made Andrew look like the winner of the exchange. And you can tell that he didn't prepare this line of reasoning beforehand because of the example that he gave right after.
all we're doing here is just testing whether or not this axiom is changeable, and it is.
It's not.
It is.
How did I change it?
Because you just said if it could be demonstrated to you that for some reason you, not personally,
I just don't think it could be demonstrated.
Yeah, okay,
That's
but
my
if it
second
were,
axiom.
yeah, but if it were demonstrated, you would change that, right?
If I just don't think it could
Yeah, but
be.
if it could, you would change it, right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
if it
so it's
could
not
be.
an unchanging standard. So theoretically, we could have a secular humanist society or secular humanist nation where they say, for instance, oh, I don't know, that there was some sort of consciousness that was associated with fetuses. Let's say that.
Mm-hmm.
Would you then say women couldn't have an abortion?
Yeah, it gets really complicated.
Oh,
when
it
comes to
gets really
abortion.
complicated suddenly.
Yeah, it does.
Now it's really complicated.
What did I tell you at the beginning?
A moral system whose sole precept is the well-being of conscious creatures will inevitably lead to contradictions and absurd situations.
This is exactly the type of contradiction and absurd situation I was talking about. This is the rapist and the victim analogy. What do you value more, the well-being of the fetus or the well-being of the mother? For the dude, it's complicated, because his system doesn't give him an answer to this predicament. It never can, because the system is by design limited, incomplete, and impractical. The problem is that Andrews doesn't realize that valuing the fetus over the mother's preferences is still a well-being based decision. Even if the dude would no longer support abortions in Andrews' hypothetical, his system would still operate based on the standard of valuing the well-being of conscious creatures. It's just that, like I said, he would be choosing the well-being of the fetus over the well-being of the mother without justification, because his moral system doesn't give him one. But Andrews' hypothetical still fails, and he just can't see it. So, where does this leave us? Well, Andrews' whole position rests on the statement,
Christian nationalism is necessary because Christianity provides an unchanging standard which progressives and secularists don't have.
which is already confusing because at no point during this discussion did Andrew actually explain what the Christian unchanging moral standard is. But that's fine, he instead focused on proving that the secular moral standard is changing. I get it. The problem is that he failed at that too, because he seemed to confuse the moral standard, which is the preference for the well-being of conscious creatures, with the morality of specific situations, actions, and events under that standard. These two things are not the same. Andrew realized this exact problem later on and finally took a shot at attacking the secular standard itself, only for him to offer a contradictory and idiotic hypothetical.
Let us assume for a moment that somebody were to provide to you evidence that there was better outcomes for everybody if you didn't care about the well-being of conscious creatures.
Which proved nothing except that Andrew would do everything to not lose the debate, regardless whether he's actually right or wrong. Which showcases the poor state of debates nowadays, where you can win by steamrolling opponents and replacing coherence with charisma, which Andrew has turned into an art, rather than being actually correct. Anyway, these are my 2 cents, let me know how you feel about it. And yes, I am back.